We hit a record $10 billion in foreign direct investments in 2017, the first full year of the Duterte administration. And latest data show FDIs in the first 2 months of the year hitting nearly $1.5 billion. That's over $500 million more than the 978 recorded in the same period last year. So far, things are looking bright and sunny, but with a looming tax package too, dark clouds seem to be on the horizon. The Senate this week will tackle the country's foreign investment laws and policies in a bid to boost the Philippines' reputation as the top choice for multinationals. Joining us to weigh in on the issue, John Forbes of the American Chamber of Commerce. Good morning, John. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning, Mimi. Glad to be back again.
Yes. So, John, our record $10 billion in FDIs last year still pales in comparison to our ASEAN neighbors. I mean, Singapore last year got $64 billion, Indonesia $22 billion, and Vietnam, a country that's very similar to the Philippines, always compared to us, got $14 billion. In one of your reports, let me quote, although the Philippines has 18% of ASEAN's population, it receives less than 8% of total ASEAN FDI. Why the disconnect, Mr. Forbes?
Well, that's been true historically. For one thing, during the great waves of outward Japanese investment in the 1970s and 80s, the Philippines was entering into a degree of political instability. So that's when Malaysia and Thailand particularly benefited. It's interesting to note in last year's FDI in ASEAN that the Philippines received more than Thailand, about the same amount as Malaysia. Indonesia, of course, is a much larger economy, almost a $1 trillion economy, and it also has oil and gas, and a lot of it's open to mining, which the Philippines is not presently. So we really must be comparing, as you noted, the Philippines to Vietnam. And Vietnam has access to the EU through an FTA, and the same FTA agreements that the Philippines does within AFTA and Japan and China and India and Australia, New Zealand, etc., but it has lower manufacturing costs. So a lot of investment is poured into Vietnam to go into manufacturing and into exports. Their exports were $214 billion last year, about 4 times those of the Philippines.
Mr. Forbes, how much cheaper is it doing business in Vietnam versus in the Philippines?
Oh, it's probably, I have not actually seen the exact comparison, but I would approximate at least a third cheaper. Electricity for manufacturing is subsidized there. The minimum wage is lower. Half the number of paid holidays. Just to give you 2 examples, Nike, which is an American company, buys from 89 factories, 27 of which make shoes, the others clothing, and employ 390,000 Vietnamese. There used to be Nike factories in the Philippines, but now there's 0. And the Philippines imports its Nike shoes and clothing from Vietnam. Another example is Samsung, which assembles electronic products, particularly half of their phones are assembled in Vietnam in factories near Hanoi. And they constitute 15% of that total of $214 billion, which is approximately the same amount of the total electronics exports by value of the Philippines. So Vietnam is doing things the Philippines has not been able to do, but the Philippines has its own specialties in manufacturing, and they should be focused on and grown as rapidly as possible. The manufacturing of the Philippines has been increasing significantly by 8% in the current decade, which is twice the rate of the previous decade, so that's good news.
Mm-hmm. But Mr. Forbes, with the tax reform package 2 coming up, I mean, we're thinking of rationalizing the incentives that we would give these foreign investors. How do you think that will affect the flow of investments into the Philippines? Do you think that will sort of wipe out the recent gains we've made over the past years?
Well, no, it's certainly not going to wipe out that because those incentives are not availed of by many of the companies in many industries here. For example, in real estate or in banking, etc. So there's a well-established existing base of foreign investors of several nationalities here that continue to expand with the economy. And that's shown in the total FDI figure of $10 billion last year, because 60% was intercompany borrowings. We're not quite sure what countries those come from or what sectors they go into, because the BSP doesn't record that data. But what is really affected are the companies that, particularly the IT or BPO sector and manufacturing. These are all export companies of either goods or services, and uncertainty has been created about whether or not their current incentives are going to continue, and that has resulted in a lowered expansion or new investor rate at the PEZA zone, and also by foreign investment in BOI, although I note that BOI total approvals are at a record high.
So, Mr. Forbes, what are we not doing correctly? Why are we still lagging behind our ASEAN peers when it comes to foreign investments?
Well, that's a tough question. Of course, nobody does it perfectly. I think that there's some sectors that are restricted, of course. I think everyone is aware of what's in the Constitution. There was a reform way back in 1989 called the Foreign Investment Act that shifted to a foreign investment negative list, which was very helpful. It removed the 60% Filipino equity requirement for domestic firms and turned to a negative list where foreign investors could take a look to see what's restricted. And that list is issued every 2 years, and there currently is the 11th negative list. I understand that's been prepared by NEDA and approved by NEDA, that is awaiting the signature of the President at Malacanang Palace. The constitutional restrictions are the business groups, not only our chamber and other foreign chambers, but the major Philippine business groups have recommended, and in fact I understand that the Constitutional Committee is also recommending that the restrictions except on land be dealt by legislation or regulation and be removed from the Constitution in the future. So that might open up some sectors. There's also law on public services that has been passed in the House that will define for the first time exactly what are public utilities and what are distinct from public services in a way that has been confused since the current law was passed in 1936. And when the Senate resumes at the end of July, I think many investors are optimistic that the PSA amendments will be passed. There also are proposals to reduce the retail trade minimum, currently at $2.5 million, down to a much lower number. And then there are other things in the foreign investment negative list that can be amended. It just takes individual laws to do that.
Mr. Forbes, so let me just clarify. You want the 60-40 rule to be, the restriction to be lifted.
Mimi, can you repeat? I can't hear you. I've lost sound with you.
Okay. Mr. Forbes, can you hear me now?
Can you turn the volume up a little bit, please?
Hi, Mr. Forbes. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
Please.
So just to clarify, you think that the restrictions, the foreign restrictions should be lifted except on land. So we should open all industries to foreign ownership 100%.
If I understood you quickly, you'd say that the reform is to open up, remove those restrictions so that up to 100% could be open to foreign investment. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct, Mr. Forbes.
Yeah. Well, that would depend on the Congress. There was a proposal in the last Congress that was approved on second reading of the House that would do exactly that. Amend the Constitution with the phrase, after each of those restrictions, except as provided by law, which actually is the language that's been in the Constitution since 1987, I'm sorry, on the professions. The practice of professions are restricted to Filipinos except as provided by law. That's much more flexible than putting a restriction in your Constitution. There have been no amendments to the 1987 Constitution, but when you could amend the law, you can catch up with contemporary developments.
And senators tomorrow will scrutinize the foreign investment policies that we have. What do you want to hear from the lawmakers?
Well, the main restrictions on PSA I just described, to define public utilities more narrowly and open up to foreign investment, telecommunications, and transportation. That would be the main effect of those amendments. The constitutional ones on media, of course, in media, my goodness, it seems a little bit antediluvian to restrict the ownership of media when most of us have stopped watching TV. All apologies to AMC, but Netflix seems to be where we're getting our entertainment. The technology has changed so rapidly and gone from just the United States to jump to Europe, and now it's all over Southeast Asia. Advertising, I think that's fairly minor. The natural resources, of course, there are a whole bunch of these. I can't single out, other than the services, retail trade that I mentioned, why any particular one will. But if you look at international ratings, OECD, at the World Bank, the Philippines falls into one of the countries that is the more restrictive. And you need as much capital in this fast-growing economy as can be attracted with your large resource base of both agriculture and people, and the situation when so many people have to go abroad to leave their families. You really do need to facilitate capital flow in, as well as use of your own capital here, for even faster GDP growth and inclusive growth and job creation.
And finally, Mr. Forbes, there are calls to shift to a federalism form of government. How do you think will shifting to a federalism form of government complicate or simplify or not affect operations in the Philippines for multinational companies setting up shop here?
Well, it clearly will affect operations. It will make them more complicated and costly. If the powers of the states, and we don't know how many states they're going to be, but clearly a dozen or more, will have different rules. You'll have national laws and you'll have state laws. I come from a country which has 50 states, and therefore when you want to get a driver's license, every time you move to a different state, the rules and the taxation on your car, if you want to move in your car, you move in a driver's license, they may differ. There are different sales taxes, there are different income taxes, there are even city taxes. So it's certainly very complicated in the United States, but since it's one of the world's largest economies, multinationals, when they go to the United States, are willing to pay the extra fees to lawyers and consultants. In Washington alone, there are over 100,000 lawyers that are helping people to figure out all the different laws and regulations, not only of the federal government, but of all the states as well. Now, when it comes to the Philippines, which is less developed, not that large of a market in global terms, although certainly moving up, it's easier in Thailand, it's easier in Vietnam, it's easier in perhaps your competing economies when you go to a single ministry in the capital to know what the rules are that apply the entire. It would definitely make it more complicated and therefore more costly, but not necessarily less attractive.
Okay, on that note, thank you very much, Mr. Forbes. Always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.